All right, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. This is a punctual group, and it's good to see all of your faces after reading lists of your names for the last year. It was great to finally meet you. Welcome to PLU, and welcome to the International Honors Program. My name is Seth Dowland. I'm starting my 15th year at PLU, my second as director of IHON. So hopefully I learned the ropes. If you were here last year on a preview day or came to talk about IHON, you probably met one of my colleagues here, but Professor Arthur Strum, who was the interim IHON director. Last year I was on a sabbatical leave, and so my thanks to Professor Strum for his expert leadership of the IHON program. He's been teaching it longer than I have, and will be many of your professors this year. But I'm going to offer some words of welcome here at the opening, and then you kind of see our agenda behind you. This is what we're going to do, hopefully, in the next hour. Talk about what is IHON 111 and 112. These are the classes that all of you will take this year. IHON 111 in the fall, IHON 112 in the spring. What do we do in those classes? How do we do that work? Why it's important. And then we will have some time at the end for you to ask your questions. But I have a few words to say before we kind of dive into the meat of the agenda. And I just want to start with my excitement about the year ahead. A big part of my excitement is that you all represent the largest class of incoming IHON students since 2018, since before the COVID pandemic. We are thrilled that you chose to be part of this program. And we hope to reward your choice with what I think is one of the richest academic experiences that we offer at PLU. And all of you are in different majors, and those obviously are going to be a big part of your academic experience, but IHON will be as well, I think particularly in this first year, be a place that you really find an academic home, as well as develop some skills and abilities that will serve you well no matter what major field you're studying. The IHON program has a lot to offer. Some of you probably heard about our Study Away program in Oxford, which is an opportunity beyond the first year that we'll talk to you more about later in the fall. But today, what we're going to focus on is the first year classes that all of you will be taking. And I want to say a few words about what kind of skills and habits you'll develop in these first year classes. You're going to learn a different way of reading closely and carefully. I know a lot of you did that in various ways in high school. I think what you'll experience, even starting this week, is maybe different than the types of reading you did in high school. You'll learn to engage in conversations that have been going on for literally thousands of years, and why your own voice matters in these conversations. You'll come to see how things we take for granted in 2025, not just modern technologies, but entire categories like race and class and nationality, are products of history. And you'll come to see how not taking those things for granted gives you a deeper and richer understanding of both the past and the present. These habits of thinking are unorthodox and difficult to learn, but richly rewarding. They will help you become better thinkers and better citizens. IHON will give you tools that will enhance your life no matter what you study or your major. I'm going to pause here just for a second to allow my colleagues over here to introduce themselves. These are our amazing they're not first year faculty. They teach the first year IHON courses and have for many years. So if each of you just stand and introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, I'm Carminiana Kader. I'm one of the faculty teaching IHON 111. This is, believe it or not, my 20th year at PLU, so I've been here quite a while. So welcome.
My name is Arthur Strum. I've taught in the IHON program since it started, actually teaching across the program, but especially focusing on the first year, so I'll probably do a lot this year.
I'm Arnold. Been teaching few times over the last few years. I've been here for, I think, 7.5 years.
I'm Christian Gerslow. You will get to see me in the spring. I teach 112 every year, and also 328, which is the culminating seminar, the program seminar. So at the end of your stay here. So,
Thanks to each of you. You'll hear more from all of these folks in just a sec. Okay, so I've been talking to some of you briefly in the lead up. It's been a busy orientation schedule, so we appreciate you all being here. I know I told you it was mandatory, but thanks for listening. The purpose of the next 45 minutes is to really kind of prepare you for what you're about to encounter in our classes, particularly in 111. We think it's important to hear this before you start your sections, because the honors program that we've developed at PLU is itself a product of a certain history. It's a particular thing, not just a generic honors program. And so that's part of what we're going to do today, is talk to you a little about the type of courses that we've developed in an ongoing process over the last 10 years or so. And so let me, can you just, put up the first slide. Sure. So IHON's been around at PLU since 2008, which I realized as I was getting ready, it's not much younger than all of you. But the program that you're entering is really a product of the last 10 years, and it's been developed mainly by the people sitting over here to my left, your right, and they're incredibly hard and thoughtful work to really think about what skills we think you need to develop in your first year in the program. The purpose of IHON is not mainly to learn content, if you put up that slide. Not to pass tests or to impress others, although you might do that naturally, but rather to open up a channel between you and many different voices from across the world, captured in artifacts, various texts that have been produced really going back 5,000 years. Starting this week in your 111 classes, you'll be reading Gilgamesh, a book almost 4,000 years old. You'll be reading that with Professor Strom or Professor Blair or Professor Arnold. And it can be unusual to encounter a text like this, not just because it is so distant, but also because it will seem quite familiar in certain ways. You can see certain characters fear of dying, another character's warning not to let one's ambitions blind one to the pleasures of everyday life. This is an opportunity you're going to have again and again in 111 and 112 to encounter these texts that were produced long ago in cultures very different from our own, and recognize that you yourself have ways to engage these texts, even though they come from these very different cultures and places. So I hope that gets you somewhat excited to encounter these texts. I also expect some of you are sitting there thinking, this can be a little scary. How in the world am I going to understand what's going on in these texts? And I think one of the things we want you to hear today is that we as professors have maybe a slightly different version of that fear when we begin to teach these texts, particularly if we're teaching them for the first time. A sense of anxiety, like, how am I going to even teach this? I don't know all there is to know. And I think what we want you to hear today is that you have all the tools you need to do the work we're going to ask you to do. We don't expect any of you to be experts, and we don't expect any of you to have a deep knowledge of the cultures that produce this. We'll give you a little bit of that. But really the point of these classes is for you to read the text and come to class and be ready to participate in a conversation about them. That's all we're really asking you to do. And so you already have the tools you need to do the work that we're going to ask you to do in 100 level classes. So there is a kind of rigor, but it's not a kind of we expect you to know it all already. The rigor that this program demands is that you do the reading and that you learn to be as precise as you can in commenting on the reading that we ask you to do. And there's an art to this, a craft. We're going to talk a little about that craft of conversation that you're going to learn. You'll probably get tired of hearing the craft of conversation by the end of this year. But that's a really big focus of the first year program. And all of us who teach in the program, we're going to help you do that. That's why we're professors. That's why we're here. We want to see you succeed in this program. We just ask that you make the commitment to do the work. And it's in doing that work and then coming together twice a week that you'll see this kind of richness develop over the course of this semester, really the entire year. And it will give you tools that I think you will find you can use in a lot of different fields around the university. So, a little word of introduction about this particular program, and now I will turn it over to Professors Strum and Arnold for their subject.
All right, so as you've already heard from Professor Dowling, we're going to focus in this course, particularly IHON 111, on reading and talking about old books, stories, plays, and poems from many different cultures up to about year 1500. That's right at the beginning of the modern globalized world we live in today. And then in our second semester together, we're going to be reading text right up to the present day. So we're going to be moving all the way from, as we said, 5,000 years of text throughout the first year, which is a lot to do. But the real question is, how are we going to read them? Of course, you could read them in all sorts of ways, so how are we going to do it? And what is the purpose of reading these texts? So we're going to start with a quote from a North American professor and writer who actually only went to 1 year of college. And that's an interesting fact about him. But the thing to think about is, in a sense, education in general is something you do on your own, just like Burke did. He did his education basically on your own. All we can really do is, as professors, as people here with you, is to help you along the way. We can strengthen your courage to learn. That's about all we can do. And we'll see how that goes. Nevertheless, Burke went on to become one of the United States' greatest cultural critics. And so we're going to share with you a quote from Burke. So, Burke says, and this is what we're going to be doing here about human conversation. He writes, imagine that you enter a parlor. You come late. When you arrive, others have long preceded you, and they are engaged in a heated discussion. A discussion too heated for them to pause and tell you exactly what it's about. In fact, the discussion had already begun long before any of them got there. So no one present is qualified to retrace for you all the steps that had gone before. You listen for a while until you decide that you've caught the tenor of the argument. Then you put your oar in. Someone answers, you answer him, another comes to your defense, another aligns himself against you to either the embarrassment or gratification of your opponent, depending upon the quality of your allies and sisters. However, the discussion is interminable. The hours grow late, you must depart. And you do depart, with the discussion still vigorously in progress. So we want to discuss this quote with you for a moment. So is there anything anyone noticed or is thinking about when they hear this quote from Kenneth Burke?
No one who's currently involved in the discussion actually knows how it started fully. It's all just, they're tracing back what they've been told came before.
So where is this what is the kind of conversation he's talking about? Where is it taking place? Can we hear about that yet? Yeah, all of us, okay. All right. So what do you think about the last line? What does it mean to say that this discussion is vigorously in progress and you do in part? What's that?
These conversations continue every generation, and most of these questions are thousands of years old in different shapes, or the same shape, just ongoing ways.
Great.
Great.
It's also saying that each person has little pieces of other civilizations of ideas that no idea what they're talking about, and we can't fit that into our
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we'll talk more about this quote in First Day on Tuesday or Wednesday. The point of this course is to do what Kenneth Burke quote suggests, to put our oar into the human conversation. Of course, this conversation, well really it's many conversations, it's not just one conversation, is going on vigorously today. But in societies like the United States, today's conversation tends to draw mostly on the present day, on present day voices. What is often left out are the diverse ways in which humans across time have posed and tried to answer basic questions they had about themselves and the world they found themselves in. How did the world begin? What is its purpose, if any, or ours as human beings? What is pleasure? What is pain? Who are we, the community that I'm in? What am I? How do we deal with crisis and change? In this course, you'll get into conversations about precisely these questions with ancient texts. The ancient texts we're going to read ask these kinds of questions and give us answers. One thing you'll see though is that nearly every text we encounter answers these questions differently. We think that by attuning oneself to these ancient voices so that you can hear them and also bring them back into the contemporary conversation, there is a potential to transform how one is oriented to oneself and to the world. We have in the first year IHON what are called guideposts. They give us a philosophical orientation while we navigate the terrain of all these texts. We'll introduce a few of them today, but we'll return to them throughout the year. But we have one that we'd like to share with you right now, which is from Marti. The conceited villager believes the entire world to be his village. So this is something we're trying to undo about ourselves, right? That we think that the entire world is our village, if you want to put it that way, right? So this is what we want to try to undo. In fact, at certain moments in our own lives, and even in our collective history, it can be crucial to have learned the habit via reading of living in many times at once. In fact, this is precisely what distinguishes us as the human animal. We tell and preserve stories from generation to generation, and later leave a written record so that we're in effect living in many times at once, even when we don't realize it. So now we're going to go on to introduce 5 more points about how we do first year IHON and what IHON is.
Okay, Adam and I are doing this section of the presentation together, so we'll go back and forth as these come up. One more. Okay, so first I'm going to talk to you a bit about, first thing to note about this course that's a bit different maybe than something you might be familiar with, is that we're not necessarily asking you to learn about these texts. And that might sound strange. We're going to read them. What do we mean by that? We're not asking you to report on existing bodies of knowledge. We're not asking you to do plot summaries or historical information that is what others have said about these texts. Not that we don't use these things, we're going to use these voices, but the point is we use these voices in order to try to open up your connection with this text in the past. So the goal is to read and think about these old stories, so to speak, and then gradually make what you read your own in some way. Even if that involves rejecting it, that's also making it your own. Take it in and have a response to it. And this is going to take some adjustment on your part, particularly if you've already studied some of these texts. Most of our students find that there's an adjustment period to get used to a different kind of reading and discussion. And most of these students also tell us they find what we're doing liberating, sometimes compared to what they have done before. So we hope that's the case for you as we start. And what I want to reiterate is what my colleague Seth Dallin said at the beginning, which is that you really do, each one of you in this room right now, each one of you has the resources to succeed in this program. We're here as professors to help you do that. That's the point of our exercise.
The second thing to notice about IHON 111 and 112 is that they're different from most of the perhaps all the courses you'll take at the university. Universities, like many or most areas of our life, are a matter of the division of labor and the expertise that comes with the division of labor. Individual academics, like machinists or nurses or baristas, are trained in specific ways. Our training leads us to use specific tools to look at our objects of study, whether it's a tree or human psychology or subatomic particles or waves. As specialists, you can see things no one else can. You share these things via what's called research, aimed at other specialists. And you share the results of your expertise with students. That's what most of your classes are going to be like. You're going to have a specialist in most of your classes, giving you introducing you to the special terminology and research of their specialty. So, you're going to, in many of your classes, you're going to be asked to learn a particular language, which people in that field of study use, and you're going to learn what the specific methods are in that field, which produce what that field or discipline calls knowledge. But IHON is different. It's not an academic discipline with specialized tools and language. You could see that already in the Kenneth Burke quote we're using as our focus. The human conversation is not one conducted only by specialists, but by people with degrees, with highly specific ways of posing and answering questions. Those degrees and those specialities didn't even in fact exist when the texts we're going to read this semester were written. Now in IHON, we may often read and refer to secondary sources from various academic disciplines, but we only do so in order to help you connect to the text we're reading and discussing, not to generate or communicate research about it, which is what an academic discipline would do. So does this make sense so far? Am I making sense? Our goal is not to learn about texts, but rather to connect to ancient voices in order to make it possible for you to perceive the human questions the text addresses. And that's something hard because those human questions may no longer be so obvious to us today.
So what we've just told you is also why we don't think you need to feel nervous about reading and discussing texts like Gilgamesh or the classics across the world. One thing I want to know, by the way, is we're focusing right now on ancient texts. Of course, in IHON 112, you're reading texts right out of the text. It's actually across the world. So what we do instead, IHON is not a discipline, but it's not part of that kind of division of labor, as Adam pointed out. But we have instead a kind of craft or art, which we have captured in various guidelines for how we discuss IHON, how we learn to discuss. And really, these guidelines are aspirational, something that we ourselves as instructors read and work on and try to improve at. We've been doing this for roughly 3 years. I hope we've gotten better at it. And we also have, as we mentioned before, these philosophical guideposts, which are sort of way markers that help us navigate this terrain, sort of general principles of thinking that we're going to keep in mind. So a third point, if we could, sorry, yeah. A third point is that many of the texts we read in this course come with various kinds of labels already attached, essentially adjectives attached, which already tell us, or are supposed to tell us something about these texts before we even read them. Think about walking to a bookstore and you see a certain text in a certain section, right? That's a kind of like philosophy, literature, so on and so forth. One reason we do this is because human beings encounter the text which compose human conversation in the way their particular society or community organizes that conversation. No one is, so you notice, ever gets the whole conversation to follow the first metaphor. We get the part which our own society, or whatever part of society we're in, has organized into its traditions. And these traditions not only include certain texts and bracket out others, but also tend to impose certain interpretations of the texts which are part of them. Notice that academic specializations of such traditions. I want to point out, there's nothing necessarily negative about the process I just described of trying to offer categories to which you can begin to pre-interpret a text. And that's necessary because if human beings are going to learn from the past, the conversations passed down through time, that kind of continuity is helpful. However, that continuity can also sometimes be unhelpful, can blind certain things. Let me give you one example of that. In the last 130 years, roughly, many people in North America who encountered authors like the Greek philosopher Plato, actually realized the Athenian philosopher Plato, did so in so-called Western culture courses. The weird thing about this label, which we've explored a lot over the decades in this program, is that in Plato's time, that label Western literally had no meaning. There was no body of people who organized themselves that way. It was not the way people describe themselves to divide themselves against others. Those labels, of course, existed, but the way people the label people were using to organize themselves were different things. So one of the things we try to do in this course is begin to open you to the complexity of these texts by making sure we don't thoughtlessly apply sort of habitual labels to things. That's the idea. Doesn't mean that labels aren't necessary and concepts aren't necessary, they are. But we want to think about what we're doing when we do that. So that's one example. So we'll read a text of Platonic dialogue in this course, like the Ecology or like Euthyphro. And those texts are often sort of labeled in certain ways, but again, those labels are often, in many cases, quite recent. So we're going to think carefully about how it is we pre-label texts. But most of all, we're going to try to do that in order to open your eyes to what these texts are so you can have a kind of fresh encounter with it. What might the text mean? How might the text mean something different than it did 50 years ago to a different reader, or 100 years ago to a different reader, or yesterday to a different reader? The point is that that meaning is always growing and changing as new people read texts and find it useful for solving the particular problems they have in their own existences, their own lives. Okay, so I've sort of skipped over. If you could go one more slide. Let's see. Actually, yeah, just back up to my third one. That's my mistake. So I meant to have a slide. One of our guideposts for this year is I won't be able to recite it from memory, so you'll encounter it in the sections. And so one thing I want to mention is when you first begin to encounter these guideposts in our sections, we don't also expect that they're immediately going to be understandable. It's fine if they're not. We're going to introduce them over the course of the semester, think about how they might relate to the kinds of thinking we're doing in class. Then we'll keep doing that in the second semester. So we hope that by the end of the year, we find that students can't do this, by the end of the year, you have your own working definition of how you use it. So that's the way we use those. Okay. Yeah, that's good.
A fourth point, the adjective Western applied to certain texts is one kind of label we're going to question the first year program. Another kind of label we're going to question is of a different kind. In academic disciplines, schools tend to come up with names and labels to refer to features of groups of texts. Words like romanticism in literary studies, deontology in philosophy, or monotheism in the study of religion, or the Renaissance in different history programs. There might be good reason why a particular school invented one of these terms to draw out a common element in a number of texts. The problem for us, who come later, is that just like for the other kinds of labels, Western world, using labels like these can prevent us from looking at the text itself closely, as we think we already know what it should say according to the label. If you label something romantic, you already think you know what that text should be doing, what it should be saying. Instead of actually looking at what's in the text, we just put a label on it. And this label causes us to notice certain things in the text, and more, what we think is equally important, it blinds us to others. This is why we're going to do our best to avoid labeling exercises like these in our classes. Instead, we'll try to see these old stories in a fresh way, by learning to listen carefully to the distant human voices contained in them, which speak about their concerns, such as, how do we learn to survive? How should we live together? What exactly is the we which binds us together? What is and why, excuse me, what is the beautiful and why do we experience it? Again, as I've said before, we're going to try to get back to the human rather than only a scholarly conversation.
So I have a last short point to make, and I do want to add one more parenthetical remark, which is that I can promise this is the only time this year you're going to listen to lecturing, because other characteristics programs, we just don't do it. So it's sort of strange that we start with this long introduction, but we feel like it's useful for you to understand the nature of the program, so we do it. So if you bear with us, I know you've been through a whole weekend of orientation already, so thank you for your patience so far. So we'll try to wrap up quickly. So very quickly, the fifth point is about the point that, of course, it's natural that when you encounter these voices from the past, you encounter some that you fundamentally disagree with, or you disagree with the fundamental oriented values. And even there, especially there, we can learn something crucial. So that experience of actually encountering something you reject can be interesting. Through this encounter, you can attain a certain distance to things that you're certain about in the present, values and presuppositions which seem obvious and natural to you. Now, wherever you see the words obvious and natural, your antenna should go up to say, well, obvious to whom and natural why exactly? So what we're trying to do is encourage a kind of questioning where the obvious and the natural become less obvious to us. And an encounter with an ancient text which challenges your presuppositions can really promote that, as well as encounters the modern texts. Okay, so I think we can just move to the last quote, which kind of captures this, which is an unofficial motto. Back it up. I guess the quote got somehow excited.
Is it beyond it, or?
No, it's not there. It's all right. I'm not sure what happened. Anyway, the quote is this. I'll just read it to you. So it's a quote from Ivan Illich, who was an activist and scholar, and he said in the talk in the late 80s, I want to cultivate the capacity for second thoughts, by which I mean the stance and the confidence that makes it feasible, possible, to inquire into the obvious. So, cultivating the capacities. Okay. Now you can see. Well,
apparently, it's only viewable in this mode.
Let's not make it go away. All right, so I want to cultivate capacity for second thought, which I mean the stance, the confidence that makes it feasible. Apparently, the spell checker doesn't like the word feasible, but it really exists, as you all know. To inquire into the obvious. This is what I call learning. So it's a strange, interesting definition of learning. It's saying learning is actually the competence, the skill or craft you've learned that enables you, and also the stance, the willingness to question the obvious and the natural, perhaps. What seems obvious, what seems natural. Those two things are necessary prerequisites or conditions of what learning is. So that's a very different model of learning than the idea that you copy content into your brain. Right? So we'll come back to this. So that's all I have to say. So I think that's it for this thing, right? So next I want to introduce my colleague, Christian Gerso, who is going to give you more details on how you do this work in class. We told you about some of the philosophical presuppositions. Now you'll hear about our class.
So I guess, yeah. All right, so how's everyone doing? Great. So again, as my colleague Professor Strum said, if there are some questions about what we've been saying, don't worry, because really what we're laying out here for the first time is the way in which we're going to practice learning throughout this entire first year. So we're going to go back to this, and we're going to practice this every day you meet with your instructors throughout the semester and in the spring as well. So by the end of the year, you will be familiar with these, well, before that, with the guideposts and what we mean by these guidelines of engaging in conversation as a way of learning in the classroom. And you will also go about this in detail in the first few weeks of 111 with your instructors. So we will be reiterating some of these points. And I'm also going to be reiterating some of what my colleague just mentioned. Just going to go in a little bit more detail in terms of nuts and bolts. So how does this look like in the classroom? And then my colleague Professor Palermo is also going to be talking about, even in more detail, some of our guidelines as to how to do to prepare before class and how to engage in conversation while you're in class. So how do we teach, right? So if this is not sort of us lecturing as we're doing now, right? So we're not going to be lecturing in when we meet you in the classroom. If we're not going just to be sort of throwing content at you so that you can spit it back at an exam and then be done with it. If we're not asking you to do that, then what do we mean by some of what we've been mentioning? How do we teach in this program? As my colleagues Arnold and Strom mentioned, what we're asking in that quote from Kenneth Burke that you interpreted so eloquently, what the kind of the model, the metaphor that we're thinking for this kind of learning is entering a conversation. And it's not exclusively a scholarly conversation. It's not exclusively a conversation of experts. It's a human conversation, right? So everyone has the tools, has what we need to engage with it. And the thing is, the reason for this is that the text that we're going to be reading engage with questions that are of general human concern, right? So to go back to the example that my colleague Professor Dallon was mentioning, Gilgamesh, a text that is thousands of years old, one of the first recorded stories that we have, right? That our fellow human beings, thousands of years ago, concocted, sort of came up with. These stories are asking questions that are relevant across our species. What happens to me when I die? Am I going to die? Why am I not immortal? What do my dreams mean? I'm having these dreams. They seem to be warning me about something, but I'm not sure how to interpret them. These are things that in different ways, with different labels, with different languages, human beings across recorded history have asked themselves. So we have the capacity to engage with these stories and with these questions if we let these voices sort of speak to us. So that also means that this conversation is open-ended, right? There is not a single one-size-fits-all formula that is going to fit or that is going to work as an answer to this question once and for all. And so then we're done with it. Our job is done. Last class, 1 hour, sort of turn off the lights. We've solved the riddle of the problem of the body and soul problem, or what it means, why we're here in this world, what is our purpose. So that means that even if some of these answers are similar, but we're also not sort of creating things out of thin air. We're engaging in some of the ways in which our fellow human beings have answered these questions, but we're always tweaking them. We're always bringing in our own version, our own answer to these questions, which of course is informed by the specific place and time in which we are, right? In our specific personal history. So this means that of course that's the rigor, right? So the rigor that we're asking here is not that you can regurgitate everything that's Bartlow said in all this text, but rather how do I sharpen my voice? How do I develop the capacity to have second thoughts, to question things that I thought were obvious, and because this is me, right? Because no one else can do this for me. It can be hard, it can be daunting, but we're going to give you the tools to do so, and hopefully you'll find it very, very exciting. And this is, in fact, what your peers who are already part of the program have said over and over, that they find this a liberating approach and that they find it very exciting to sort of develop their own voice as they're responding or engaging with these texts. So, I guess next slide. We are, as my colleague President Allen said, we're going to be using these metaphors of craft or an art, right? So engaging in conversation together in the classroom is like practicing an art, like practicing a craft. I know that we've had over the past a lot of musicians, some musicians in the program, or maybe people who are in the visual arts, athletes, or whatever it is that you like and that you practice as a craft or as an art, right? So it's something that has certain rules, right? A certain way of making it. Think about that as your metaphor for what we're going to be doing here. How we're going to be reading these texts and then talking about them. Because the thing about, on the one hand, we'll say, well, don't worry if you don't have like all of the contextual knowledge. On the other hand, that puts a sort of a special sort of pressure on us. Because, so for instance, think that you're in a band and you're playing your instrument and you have rehearsal. You cannot ask, you're not sort of feeling like, I don't know, today, I don't know if I want to play. Like, I know this piece, whatever, I'm not super excited about this piece, so I'm not going to show up to rehearsal. You cannot ask your peer to play for you and then report back and say, yeah, this is what rehearsal was like. And then you magically sort of be able to replicate the way that you play together. Right, so we don't do that. When we are an athlete, we don't just sort of ask someone else to practice for us before the game. So, this is what it's like for us here. So this is why there's no substitute for the conversation that you're going to be engaging with in the classroom with your peers or with your professors, right? So this is the rigor, right? This is what we're asking you to do. The next slide, please. So this is sort of speaking a little bit of this metaphor. This contemporary novelist, British novelist Sadie Smith, thought of in an interview some 20 years ago, was thinking of reading precisely in these terms. So think about reading as though you were an amateur musician. And amateurs, because it's not necessarily whether you're a professional or not. The question here is not whether you're a professional musician or not, but it's something that you take up because it gives you joy and you want to do it. So what would happen if we approached reading that way? Right, if instead of I need to absorb everything so that I can put it back in an exam, I treat it as something that I come back to and I want to get better at, just as I do when I'm playing an instrument, when I'm learning to play an instrument, and crucially, playing together with others. Because that's how it's going to be like to engage in conversation in the classroom. So each conversation, each interpretation that you come up together about the text is as though you're playing a piece. So it's going to be a unique performance each time. Again, this is why there is no substitute for that. So what would it be like to read as though you sat at the piano, had your piece of music in front of you, which is the work, or the text, Gilgamesh, whatever you were discussing that day. And probably you cannot comprehend that, entirely. But there are things that we're not going to get about what this text tells us. But like a musician, we have certain skills about reading, about interpreting character, story, plot. And the greater the skill, the greater gift that you can give back to this reading, and that the reading gives to you. So it's also, what we're getting at with this metaphor is that reading is kind of like an act of collaboration between you and the author, even if the author passed away centuries ago. But they gave us these stories, they gave us these voices, sometimes very, very distant because they're coming through translation. But, you know, we might as well read them, right? So we don't all sort of read classical Greek, but we're not going to deprive ourselves from experiencing these readings, even if they're coming to us in translation. If you're so excited about the Odyssey and you want to become a classics expert and learn classical Greek, even better. But even if there is that distance, they're giving us these stories, and the more we practice our craft, our skill of interpreting them, the more they have something to give us. But we're also giving something back, because if we go back to that metaphor of a conversation, we're giving, as we're participating in this human conversation, in this parlor, we're giving something back to our communities. We are sharing these stories in the classroom, and perhaps then outside of the classroom, with our peers, with our family, with our friends. Hey, I just read this story, it's amazing. It's just incredible. I remember the first time I read Gilgamesh, it was like, I was amazed about how the story that old sort of talked about all these things that of course are important to us. Okay, so this is kind of like a metaphor that is going to be guiding us as a way of sort of thinking how we practice this craft, and a little bit more kind of like, again, sort of nuts and bolts. So how do we do it? What are some of the things we need to do? I guess the next slide, very basic, right? So you have to be present, come to class, also devote some time to doing the reading before class, right? So slowly, patiently. Professor Bowler is going to talk more about that in more detail. Next slide. Again, this is kind of like reiterating some of what I was saying. This is not about you reporting, also what Professor Strum mentioned. We're not in classes where you have to show in your major that you know the basics about biology, because if not, then you cannot move to the next topic, right, the next semester. In other words, there is something legitimate, obviously, about being able to show within your disciplines that you have basic knowledge about that particular topic. But here, again, this is not what we're doing. But what we're doing is not asking you to report on sort of a pre-existing body of knowledge, but rather just cultivating of your own voice, which it takes time, but hopefully you'll find pleasurable. The next slide. If the text is like our score, our musical score, then that's what we're talking about, right? If you're in band and you start playing a different tune, then the whole performance collapses, right? So you need to focus on that text itself. Of course, you can bring up other references, right, from outside if they illuminate something about that particular text. But mostly the focus will be on that particular text. Next slide. We will talk more about this in the coming weeks. What we mean by reading convivially or practice convivencia, which is a word taken from Spanish, we could more or less translate as sort of, I guess, sort of coexisting with others peacefully. Let's coexist with these texts and treat them not as enemies, something to find fault with, but rather as collaborators. So again, this will become clearer as you engage in your classes in the next few weeks and throughout the first year. But basically the idea here is that sometimes we think that the best way to engage with a new text is to first focus on the thing that we don't like. Focus on the thing that we think is wrong, right? And in some cases, we've actually been rewarded for that, right? So we think that is actually sort of the most rigorous way of engaging with a text. Like, I don't like this. The author, is using a word that I have a problem with here. The issue with that is that tends to shut down the conversation, right? Even though we may feel that we've actually sort of, showed everyone and the author that there was something wrong here, we're not letting the text sort of give us what it can give us. It may be the case that you're not going to like every text, right? It may be the case that after you give it a try, you say, you know what, I like this other text better. But first, treat it as though you are a collaborator, a co-worker toward a common project. That doesn't mean that you're going to agree with everything, but you're working towards something together. In that way, by hearing it in this particular way, you can take as much from it as you like, and then move on from other aspects that you didn't enjoy as much. That's perfectly fine. By this, we don't mean give up your values, your commitments, your tastes. That's not what we mean by that. But rather, it is actually more productive, hopefully more engaging and stimulating. First, let it speak in its own terms as much as possible, this text, and then see what, together with your peers, you can build together as a form of interpretation. All right? So that's it.
Can we start? Oh, yeah, I'm just going to skip 2 slides. Hi. So the good news is that everything that you've heard about today, we're going to be practicing those habits in class the first 4 weeks in class. Okay, so these are things that we're going to learn as habits of discussing and leading conversation and reading. We're going to be doing it together, collectively, in all our IHON 111 sections. So for these sections, as we read together, right, these texts and open up this conversation, it's just going to be you, your classmates, and the text, right? And we're going to be doing that in the next 4 weeks. So what kinds of habits or what kinds of things are we going to be doing in class? A lot of students always ask us, how does that look like, right? When we're coming into the class, what's going to happen, right? If there are no lectures, right? There's no kind of reading guides or anything like that. How does that actually look like? And so I'm going to give you some examples of what that would look like. So what we're doing as we're reading and having a conversation together with the text and with your peers, we're not trying to extract information, but we're simply reading and kind of considering, right? It's the reading itself that's important, and the kinds of ideas that we're getting from that reading in conversation with one another. I think the quote from Burke is really important, is that from the very beginning we try to put in our oar, right? Sometimes we wait for the perfect moment to be able to speak, and sometimes that if you do that, that will never happen, right? And so you just need to be brave and you need to just get into the conversation. And again, we're not asking you to be experts in anything. We're not asking you to answer specific predetermined questions. We're asking you to participate in an open conversation with your peers on the text. The next one, what we're doing is we're going to be reading slowly, and as Nietzsche puts, profoundly. Slowly, profoundly, attentively, prudently, with inner thoughts, with mental doors ajar, so that you are opening yourself up to this particular text and what they're trying to convey across millennia, with delicate fingers and eyes, right? So this is kind of the kind of sensibility that we ask you to come as readers and as conversing also. And I would say this would also apply to listening to your peers, right? You will want to do that attentively, right? Prudently and with inner thoughts. So that's what we'll be doing. The next one is that we'll also be connecting our observations to specific passages of the text, right? So that's what we mean by reading slowly and prudently, is that we'll be talking about particular passages, right, where everybody's thoughts can just kind of sit right in that passage and be able elaborate. Somebody might bring a thought in that you never thought about before, right? So it's always a collective endeavor, right, of discovery, right? There are no right answers. It's kind of something that we're doing together. Next one. Trust yourself. That is really important, especially when you're thinking about putting in your core in, right? We will learn, we're all learning to trust our own faculties, to think for ourselves, which is why we don't assign reading guides or reading questions that we need to answer as you read the text. So trust yourself, that's really important. We will also practice writing on your texts, so you will also know that our courses, our classes, space of the classroom is like a technology-free zone, so you'll only have your readers, your text, and our voices in our conversation. So we invite you to write on these texts, right? You may want to highlight a passage that interests you, a question that arises as we read, something you enjoy reading, and then these notes, whether on the margin or on your IHON journal, which we're going to provide for you in each one of the sections, will help you engage in the conversation. But these notes are an important way for you to engage with the text also, right? So as we transition from reading in the classrooms for you, reading on your own, right? You're going to want to be doing this as you're reading to prepare for the conversation in the class. At the same time, the next slide is that as we're reading together, each of you is also engaging in an internal conversation. It's really interesting, right? It's happening at the same time. You're both having a conversation with your peers, but also an internal conversation with yourself, right? It's what Hannah Arendt called the soundless dialogue between me and myself, by which you begin to understand what you think about something. And so, be ready to listen to that interior voice and thoughts. As we read, we will also, next slide, try to attune ourselves to the text. And Dr. Gerst already talked about this. Sadie Smith, again, she's like one of our IHON favorites, I suppose. So it says, lower your defenses and try to attune yourself to the uniqueness of the work you're reading or looking at or hearing, right? So the attunement part is what's going to be happening also in the next 4 weeks of class. Hopefully something that you can cultivate that then you can take with you as you do the reading on your own. The next slide. Oh no, next one. Okay, and one of the things also is be patient with yourself. The process of coming to understand the text means also not understanding and being at a loss, right? That's okay. And you'll see a lot of times you might end up, a discussion in a section and think, well, what now? I don't understand anything, and that's okay. Feel comfortable with loss, and also feel comfortable with silences, right? Sometimes we might all be stumped, including myself. Like, what does that mean? And silence is okay. It's very productive, very rich. So we will practice this together. Silences, right? Feeling lost. We'll practice that in class. Later in the semester, if you're feeling frustrated, right, by what you're reading, try setting it down, right? Coming back to it later, and revisiting in different moments. Give it time. Some of our students have told us in the past that they found sometimes with a very frustrating text that reading it while walking around and saying it out loud to themselves helped kind of lower kind of the affective filter there. After discussion, go back to the text, right? We read areas that were discussed, right? Or that you found missing in the discussion, annotate some more, right? This will set the stage for kind of the provisional conclusions that you will be writing throughout the semester. And so also to remind you that the process is cumulative. You won't learn something, be tested on it, and then move on. You won't be tested at all, as it was stated before. The point is to remember what you read and stage kind of dialogues between what you've already read and what you're reading now, since we're dealing with these kind of enduring questions, right? Writing your thoughts thoughts and passages in your IHON journal is also a good way to do this, right? So you're keeping up kind of this dialogue in your writing in terms of the conversation. Okay, so if you're in trouble, right, please email your professor, come to offer student hours, right? We're here to help, we're here to support, and so we'll be happy to do that with you. Keep the communication lines always open. And the last one is, again, we've accentuated this a lot, no exams, no participation related grade, in fact, no conventional grades at all. And we will learn more about that in your sections, starting this week, right? Thank you.
All right. So I realize we are actually a little past 2:30. Some of you may have things you need to run off to. So if you do, you're not going to offend us by stepping out. But I also did want to open space to hear what questions you have. And we'll do some kind of verbal questions, and then if you're the type of person who'd rather gather your thoughts and think about it. All of you should have gotten an email from me a couple days ago, and then again this morning. Feel free just to hit reply. And if it's a question that's more better directed at your professor, I'll pass it along to them, but I'm happy to receive questions that way. So are there questions for me or for any of our panelists? Yeah.
How, in terms of leniency, what does that look like for an athlete? I'm also a nursing major.
Yeah.
Taking this class, missing class for sure because of games.
Yeah. Yeah. We of course accommodate any kind of university related absence. Some people have those, but we do ask that, barring that or illness that you don't want to bring your classmates, you do need to be in class. And I think going back to Professor Palermo's slide about emailing your professor, that's the best course of action early in the semester. I think there's standard forms, but here's the list of the dates that I have a game that I can't be in class. But otherwise, being in class is the work of IHON 111.
I just want to reiterate, we've had hundreds of athletes, I think hundreds of nurses at this point. So
Yeah.
you're walking a well-trod path, and it's worked out nicely, so we'll help you with that.
A lot of music majors, so.
We've had
yeah,
everybody.
Yes,
So-
yes.
Yes.
What materials are we expected to bring to class?
Always the reader.
Yeah, the reader, the text, right? There are 2 texts that you're having to buy, and then the course readers, which are you have to buy at the copy center. We'll send an email about that. Like, don't worry. None of that is going to happen this week. It'll be next week. Okay, so we'll tell you all about that.
You don't need to bring anything.
No.
We're going to give you things in the first 2 days of class.
Yes.
So just show up.
Yes, that's right.
The rest
Yes.
will
You
follow.
don't need to bring yoga mush on the first day?
No, no.
Okay.
What was
How
the
long?
question?
How long will the readings take for last?
The official answer is it depends.
Oh, how long will you spend on Gilgamesh? How long will you spend?
It just depends. It's generally later in the semester a week for different texts. We're reading mostly excerpts of text. Gilgamesh we're going to take 2 weeks because we're going to read it together in class.
In class.
Yes.
Yep.
Are we doing all of our readings in class, or are we also reading outside class?
You're also reading outside of class, and it's the first couple of weeks or 4 weeks where you're going to be reading short pieces, contemporary pieces at home, and then we're going to read some of the ancient texts in class together.
And part of the reason we're doing it in class, which might seem kind of odd, is that we're trying to build a certain capacity for a different type of reading. And so we don't want you to kind of send you off without the tools to do that. And so we're going to have you doing it together in class so that you know what we're expecting when it's time to read out.
Does the worksheet mostly the same problem as yours?
especially at 111. 112 might be some different, but still a lot together. Where you really start to see differences in classes is when you get to the 200 level. There's a little more variability in the type of work. Although we all still try to, I teach primarily at the 200 level, and we're still trying to teach to the same set of learning outcomes and program philosophy.
I have running start credits, so I will only be here 2 years. So I was just wondering, like, how does that play with, like, there's a lot of classes I assume.
There's, yes, so this is a conversation that you and I should probably have, and I'm happy to continue it, but for those of you who might be in a similar situation, the total program is 7 courses, and it gets trickier to fit that into 2 years than it does to 4 years, but it may be that you're exempt from one of those courses. We can work that out. It's a case-by-case kind of thing as opposed to the general, here's what happens.
Let me just add that you're inheriting a new curriculum in IHON that we actually expressly designed to make it easier for students that are coming into credit, which there are quite a few. So one of the things that this year is that you have 111 and 112, and you also have the opportunity to do 2 courses during J-term. For the first time, we're going to offer courses in J-term for first-year students, taught by Professor Dallin, taught by me, and that will allow you to finish the first year with essentially half the program done. Because of those 7 courses, the last one is a 1-unit course, so it's easy to fit in your schedule. So you can finish most of this program in the first year.